Hi, good evening. My name is Francesca Bregoli, and I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our second public event of the fall semester. This evening's program will feature a conversation between professors Ayala Fader and Omri Elisha about Ayala's most recent book, Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age, which was recently published by Princeton University Press. And I want to alert you to a 30% discount currently run on the book, and you'll find the code in the chat box momentarily. We will start tonight with an introduction by Professor Fader that would be followed by a conversation between her and Omri Elisha. And towards the end of the program, of course, there would be also an opportunity for questions from the audience, but because we have a fairly large audience tonight, please use the chat box for questions. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box and I'll make sure to read it for you towards the end. This event, as I mentioned before, will be recorded and it will later be uploaded to the center's YouTube channel. So I want to invite you to keep your microphones muted and please feel free to turn your cameras off if you have any concerns about privacy. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for tonight. Ayala Fader is professor of anthropology at Fordham University and a specialist on the anthropology of Judaism. Her research focuses on contemporary North American Jewish identities and languages in urban centers such as New York, with a focus on gender, language, and culture, and media. And she is the author of Mitzvah Girls, Bringing Up the Next Generation of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn, also published by Princeton, and the recent Hidden Heretics that she'll be discussing tonight. Omri Elisha is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Queens College and the Graduate Center. His research on the anthropology of religion and North American Christianity has focused on conservative evangelical revivalism, faith-based activism, media, and ritual performance. His current work examines notions of expertise, professionalism, and cosmology among contemporary Western astrologers. He is the author of Moral Ambition, Mobilization and Social Outreach in Evangelical Megachurches from the University of California Press. Ayala, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesca, and the Center for Jewish Studies for inviting me, and to Omri for being such a great interlocutor over what has become years now, actually. It's really wonderful to be with you tonight. It reminds me of how important it is to be together, even on Zoom, with friends and colleagues to talk about ideas. So I'm very grateful to be here with you all. I'm going to begin by reading a few pages, the story of Yisrael, and provide a little bit of historical and ethnographic context. And then, as Francesca said, Omri and I will have a conversation, and then we'll certainly open it up to you, to your questions. So without further ado, I'll begin reading. Yisrael was an earnestly pious boy growing up Hasidic in Brooklyn, New York. With his side curls grazing his shoulders, thick plastic glasses, and big black velvet yarmulke, he looked like all the other boys in his yeshiva, where he studied Torah and its commentaries from early in the morning until late at night. But when he was 13, Yisrael began to notice contradictions that troubled him in the religious texts he was studying. He didn't initially doubt the truth of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, but he had problematic questions, what are called in Yiddish iminakashas, questions about faith. Only once did he timidly confide in his teacher, a rabbi, who angrily warned him that such questions came from the sin of masturbation. From then on, confused and ashamed, he kept his questions to himself and tried, as he told me, to push them under the rug. At 18, he got married, and he and his wife, Ruchi, whom he barely knew but grew to adore, had 5 children in quick succession. To support his growing family, Yisrael eventually stopped studying Torah and began, as many Hasidic men do, to work in information technology. However, when he was 29, his questions began to nag at him again, and this time, thanks to his work with computers, he turned to the internet, secretly searching for and reading forbidden scholarly articles on theology, biblical criticism, and science. He hoped to finally find answers to his questions about faith in these non-Jewish sources, but they only provoked more questions. He decided then, he told me, that he had to take his questioning all the way. Late at night, sitting alone in his kitchen after everyone had gone to bed, he began reading some of the then popular heretical ultra-Orthodox blogs. These led him to online forums of the day where, writing under a pseudonym in Yiddish and in English, Yisrael debated with ultra-Orthodox Jewish doubters and even some who had openly left Jewish orthodoxy altogether to go OTD, or off the derech, off the path. He tried to convince them and himself that they were wrong. All of his searching, he told me, remembering his anguish, tortured him, but he could not stop. Eventually, his questions gave way to doubt in the central premise of ultra-Orthodox Jewish authority, that God revealed the Torah to the Jews at Mount Sinai through Moses. Yisrael was in such agony at this heresy that he secretly began to make phone calls to consult rabbis outside of his community who specialized in answering questions of faith. Their arguments failed to convince him. Despite continuing to observe the mitzvahs, the 613 prohibitions and commandments that had always directed every aspect of his life, he began to doubt their divine truth. The first time he ever violated one of the commandments was on a Sabbath evening in 2012. His youngest was crying, and he knew that turning on the musical mobile above her crib would calm her down. Observant Jews do not turn electricity on or off during the Sabbath. He stood alone in the dark with his hand on the switch for a long time. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and then he switched it on. Each time he broke another commandment, like using his phone on Shabbos or skipping daily prayers, he told me he felt a sense of freedom, finally in control of his life. That was when he became one of a growing number of what most ultra-Orthodox call in English double life, or ITC, in the closet, or what Yiddish-speaking ultra-Orthodox call Bahaltana Apikorsim, hidden heretics. Men and women who practiced religiously in public, including at home, but who often violated the commandments in secret because they no longer believed them to be God's words to his chosen people. Yisrael and others like him kept their double lives secret to protect their families and for fear of being cast out in a world they were ill-prepared to navigate. In 2014, his wife Ruchi, Yisrael's wife Ruchi, finally confronted him. She had noticed that in the intimacy of their bedroom, he had stopped washing Nagelwasser, the ritual hand washing, upon waking each morning. She asked him if he still prayed, if he kept the Sabbath, did he still believe? Hiding in their bedroom closet and whispering late at night so their children wouldn't hear, he told her everything. She was devastated and told me she cried for 3 days straight. And then just a few months later, the Vad Hatznius, the Committee on Modesty, a group of self-appointed activists and rabbis, contacted Yisrael through his brother-in-law. They somehow knew that he had just bought a book on science from Amazon for his 12-year-old daughter, which included a section on the theory of evolution, which Hasidic Jews reject. Yisrael's world was literally falling apart, and that was when I met him. He told me his story as it was unfolding. He and his wife were trying to figure out how to make their life work together again. He had promised her that he would keep practicing in front of the children. He hoped it was enough. With her permission, he gave me Ruchi's number, and I began to talk with her too, on the phone and on Facebook. Ruchi, who used to rely on her husband for spiritual guidance, told me how his doubt had begun to affect her, how she worried about her own glitching or slipping, how her new sense of responsibility for the ruchnius, or the spirituality in their home, traditionally the authority of the husband. Yisrael's secret was hers now too. She could tell no one, not even her mother or her sisters who lived across the street. She told me she was scared, angry, and heartbroken all at once. The Committee on Modesty warned Yisrael to sign a contract promising that he would stop using any social media, part of the growing effort by ultra-Orthodox religious authorities to control the internet and protect the community from what was increasingly called the crisis of emunah, or the crisis of faith. Then the committee threatened to expel his children from school and to tell Yisrael's parents unless he and Ruchi agreed to see a religious therapist, someone who worked with a rabbi and then reported back to the committee. Some ultra-Orthodox Jews believe that religious doubt might be symptomatic of an underlying mental illness, perhaps depression, a trauma, or anxiety, something that could be treated and cured. Afraid, Yisrael and Ruchi tried a number of different therapists, religious and secular, but none helped Yisrael regain his faith. What Yisrael called his journey was still unfolding. Would he and his wife stay together? And if they did, would her faith continue to slip? Would the religious authorities and institutions be able to control the decisions Yisrael and his wife made? Would they expel his children, which would have serious repercussions for the entire family's life, especially when it came time for matchmaking? Where did his responsibilities as a parent lie, especially as his children got older? Those living double lives are part of a broader 21st century generational crisis of authority among the ultra-Orthodox. Despite their robust demographic growth, there have been increasingly loud struggles over competing knowledge and truths. The internet facilitated the formation of a public oppositional voice, one that included anonymous expressions of life-changing doubt and validated radically changing perceptions of oneself in the world. Gender was key to the experience of and possibilities for living double lives, since gender structures authority in both ultra-Orthodox life and its alternative public. Begun in online spaces, but soon crossing over to meetings in person, this alternative public gave a platform to dangerous questions. Who should have the authority for making life choices? What and who defined Orthodox Judaism or self-fulfillment or an ethical life? The pages ahead ask what double lifers' everyday struggles can tell us about religious doubt and social change in the digital age. So let me begin by clarifying that doubt is really inherent to all religions. In fact, doubt in many ways defines and refines faith. Doubt is expected, it ebbs and flows over the life cycle, and this is the kind of doubt that remains individual and in interiors. It doesn't usually disrupt religious practice. My focus in Hidden Heretics is what I call life-changing doubt. And it's different. It's a kind of doubt that challenges the entire theological structure of orthodoxy. Life-changing doubt refused to stay inside, and it led people to disrupt or stop their religious practice. Often this kind of doubt makes people leave their communities. But those living double lives couldn't. They didn't want to hurt their families, or they were too scared to leave their communities. They didn't feel they could survive in the outside world. So they stayed, keeping this dramatic change a secret. Eventually, like Yisrael, many went online and found others, which created anonymous networks of doubters who over time began to meet secretly in person and explore forbidden worlds together and break Jewish laws away from their families. Life-changing doubt had familial and communal implications. Even when kept secret, it affected spouses, children, and over the time I was doing fieldwork, it drew increasing attention from religious leadership, activists, and religious therapists, who are all the people who tried to help those with life-changing doubt. So now just a little context, and then we'll begin our conversation. While the numbers of those living double lives and fellow travelers are really not reliably known, I've heard estimates from 100 to tens of thousands worldwide. They increasingly figure large in the ultra-Orthodox imagination, as do those who have gone OTD or who have left their communities. And this is despite, as I mentioned, ultra-Orthodoxy's continued robust demographic growth. Some religious authorities blamed people living double lives on what they called a crisis of amina, or a crisis of faith. Some said that religious orthodoxy had gotten too stringent. Some blamed trauma or mental illness, in a way pathologizing life-changing doubt. And other rabbinic leaders blamed the internet, particularly smartphones, which created opportunities for private exploration and all kinds of community building. And I'm sure we'll talk about the internet a little bit more, but it's just important, I think, to note that the ultra-Orthodox historically in the post-war period in the United States have really not rejected new technologies or science, for that matter, out of hand, as long as they could redeem, either through Jewish content or creating a Jewish form, different bodies of knowledge or different technologies. Over the past decade, though, the internet really became a flashpoint for what I see as a wider crisis of authority. Those living double lives tapped into what was a broader generational backlash of Hasidic and yeshivish men, so two different kinds of ultra-Orthodoxy, in their late 20s, 30s, and early 40s, who had become frustrated and cynical with their communities for a range of reasons. Some of these included a kind of cynicism over their political rabbinic leadership, as there were struggles over succession, as some of the European rabbis and rabbis died and their families really fought over who would inherit big amounts of power and wealth. There were economic challenges, as we all know, to living in New York, especially with 9 or 10 kids. Men with limited educations, especially fluency in English, were frustrated that they couldn't provide for their families. And finally, there was the sexual abuse scandals, which, like the Catholic Church scandals, revealed that there were rabbis in positions of power who had abused children and then were simply moved to other schools or in transnational other settings. So there's a kind of disillusionment in general. And this is the broader context that set the stage for many living double lives who were fed up with what they called the system. And finally, just a word on ethnographic method. So I wrote Hidden Heretics after doing ethnographic fieldwork for about 5 years. I followed people living double lives where they let me. I went online, in person, to parties, to blogs, to bars, to closed WhatsApp groups. So the ethnographic research, the participant observation, really took place on digital media and in face-to-face contacts. I had a surprising level of access to people living double lives because, of course, they had their own agenda. I think many of them wanted me to tell their stories, to show their families and their communities that they were indeed ethical people. But I realized midway through the research that I had to account for the perspective of religious therapists, outreach rabbis, and life coaches who tried to help those living double lives when they were discovered, either a spouse or through confession. So I decided to conduct interviews with them too. And where I could, I went to, for example, a religious therapist conference. I went to religious therapist workshops, to a working group, so that I basically could understand both perspectives. And one of the real challenges of this project was to protect anonymity, since people I was speaking to, that people living double lives, had really so much to lose. So I don't use the real names of people I met. Some of the people I've sort of either conflated or sort of hidden some of their identifying markers. I don't name specific Hasidic groups, and I've also changed identifying neighborhoods and other personal details. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more too. But Omri, I'm ready when you are. We can't hear you.
You need to unmute yourself.
I got it.
Somebody has to forget to do that.
Thanks, Ayala, and thank you, Francesca. So let me begin by saying that I am not a scholar of Jewish studies, as Francesca pointed out in her introduction. I'm, first of all, here as someone who has followed the development of this project pretty much since its inception. And I've been very eagerly looking forward to when this book was going to come out. And now that it's come out, and here I have my copy, it's also a very attractive book. And I just taught it last week in my graduate seminar, and so it has not been a disappointment. And I'm also here as an anthropologist of religion, with an interest in many of the same issues that this ethnography addresses. Because in some ways, I mean, what's interesting is that in some ways the story that Ayala is telling here is very specific to the community that she's talking about. It's very unique to the dynamics of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, especially in New York. But of course, it also speaks to larger issues that all of us who study religion are concerned with, issues about the relationship between religion and modernity, religion and media, struggles over questions of the authenticity of the self and social dynamics around questions of religious authority. So all of this is in there. And I really want to encourage everybody here who's listening to read this book, no matter what your background, no matter what discipline you're in, whether you're an academic or not. This book is really a pleasure to read. And it's rare that one can use that word pleasure about a book and actually mean it. And I don't get any commission.
I'll pay you later.
By the way, on it is a very enlightening and refreshing, and I mean, it's very poignant, but it's also very enjoyable and fascinating. And as Francesca put in the chat, there is a discount that's offered through a link that's being provided here. So this ethnography is very rich in detail, and Ayala's analysis is both sophisticated and accessible. That's why I'm saying that really anybody can read this and get something from it. And this book is also very generous to the voices of those who are being written about. Even though Ayala went to great lengths to protect the anonymity of her subjects, and we will talk about that a little bit later, she really covers all the bases, or as many bases as one can imagine, in allowing people to speak for themselves, allowing their own discourses to come in their own language. Of course, as someone who studies language or studies anthropology from the perspective of language, Ayala places a lot of emphasis on that and gives a lot of room for language to breathe and to be heard. and from every angle. And one other just thing I want to say while I'm heaping praise on this book is that it's also very impressive in its tone, because I think that Ayala, you were really working to strike a balance between respecting the seriousness of what are really conflicted and challenging and sometimes very emotionally painful lives, the lives of these double lifers. And at the same time, you recognize and you create some space for the humor and reflexivity and creativity of these people as they talk about their lives and as they create these venues and these almost, these dialects through which to reframe their understanding of themselves and to attempt to even reform the kind of Judaism that they practice while also keeping these secrets. So, there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of pain, and that's a difficult, balance to strike. But, it's a book about Jews, so, what else are you going to do? There's always going to be a little bit of humor and a little bit of pain. So there are a lot of issues that we can tap into and talk about. This book doesn't just cover the lives of the double lifers, but also various aspects of modern day ultra-Orthodox culture that are part of their stories. So the mediascape that intersects with this community and that exists outside of this community, the rabbinic politics and controversies, issues of gender, which we'll talk about, the family, and as Ayala mentioned, also psychotherapy. And I think it's also a very interesting study to look at, especially for those of us who are now beginning to confront and struggle with the implications of doing research on contemporary life in the time of COVID, and even in a post-COVID age, where a lot of our research is going to be like this. And and it's frustrating, and we want to pretend like it's not true, but it's going to happen, and it's happening right now for those of us who are doing ethnography. And Ayala, this book in a way, is ahead of its time in the sense that Ayala had to do so much of this research online and through digital media in ways that many of us are still very new to. Some of us are new to digital media altogether, and certainly doing research through these media, which really shatters a lot of the normal expectations that we have about what it means to do fieldwork. I found it very helpful to see some of the ways that you had already started to work through these questions. And as I said, we'll have a chance to talk about it. The first thing I wanted to ask you about, because really I'm just here to ask questions and have you talk more about the book, is what you describe in the beginning of the book, and you alluded to in your comments, as the continuum of doubt. One of the things that I think is useful in your discussion about doubt is that you don't reify doubt as a singular state of mind that can be spoken of in general terms. You historicize doubt, you contextualize doubt, and you relativize doubt. And you show that doubt is not just a way of thinking, but it's a process, it's an ethical position, it's a paradigm that people live with, that they talk through, that they respond to, and in very different ways. And this is the beauty of ethnography, or at least, my feeling about the beauty of ethnography is that, we don't just, cultural anthropology, which is my discipline, we don't just study cultural diversity, we also study the internal diversity and the internal variation within communities, including those that we imagine to be homogeneous. Or uniform in their beliefs. And very often we find that there are these continuums and there are these different layers. And so you talk about doubt in these ways. So first thing, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that a bit, the continuum of doubt, and what sorts of people and what sort of positions exist on that continuum of doubt. Yeah. And then I also wanted to attach to that the fact that what you call, or I think what they call, the Jewish blogosphere, what you call this counter-public, this media space, this mediated digital space where people are blogging and communicating, it takes all of these people who are embodying these different forms of doubt and creates a kind of space of commonality, which is interesting, right? So on the one hand, we have this fragmentation of doubt, and on the other hand, we have the way in which the internet has provided a kind of location for the development of a discursive community. So first question is, about this continuum of doubt. And then can you talk about what kind of discursive space is being created to accommodate this continuum?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. And thanks for those kind words, Omri. That means a lot. So once I defined life-changing doubt, as opposed to the doubt that is part of faith, I just assumed that everybody was sort of operating with the same kind of life-changing doubt. And I actually assumed that meant they were all atheists, that everybody had become an atheist. When in fact, I began to actually ask people what they meant by losing their faith, I realized that there was, as Omri said, a kind of continuum. And I actually worked on this with several different people who were important community consultants who helped me to sort of separate out the different kinds of life-changing doubt. The thing that's critical about this kind of doubt, the whole continuum, is that it always shaped religious practice. It wasn't just that they were thinking like, oh, well, maybe that's not true. There were always some kinds of implications for whether they were gonna either change the religious practice or begin to break certain religious obligations. And what I especially appreciated about about the continuum was that they were labeled with Yiddish or Hebrew or English categories. So the first one, and I would say at the kind of the least radical, was an Aufgeklärter. I had to learn what that meant. It was a reference actually to the Jewish Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries. It means open-minded. And these were people who read widely. They were kind of more relaxed about their religious obligations. They weren't so stringent. And it wasn't so terrible to be an Aufgeklärte person. You could just be known in the community as somebody who was more open-minded. The next level was apikorsim. These are skeptics. And they were very critical of their communities, what they called the system. They were critical of the rabbinic leadership, and they too would begin to break certain obligations, religious obligations. The next were kofrim, or heretics, and they actually were the ones who rejected divine revelation. And that sort of brought the whole house of cards tumbling down. And then all the way at the other end were atheists. One thing that was interesting to me was that over time, somebody could move through each of these positions. So they could start out by just being a kind of open-minded person, and then over time become an atheist. Or they could remain at that level that they were their entire lives. Usually they moved a little bit between one or the other. What was really important to me, and what I realized only after time, was that these are gendered categories as well. I didn't hear women using these terms, and women who had life-changing doubt, they were often described as either in sexualized terms or as some kind of emotional crisis. So these were really men's terms. They were terms that have a historical background. There are lots of heretics and skeptics in Jewish history. And so they were familiar. And in some ways, they built on that kind of recognition and that kind of history. Now onto the blogs and social media. Really, the internet during the time that I was doing research, there was a real struggle over many different groups about how to understand and interpret what they called the internet, which eventually came to mean smartphones, but was initially blogs. So there was a kind of movement as technology changes so fast. They started out actually in forums, and then they went to blogs, and it was the Jewish blogosphere that really blew up, but then quickly moved in the mid-2000s over to social media. Things like Facebook and WhatsApp is very popular, and now Reddit. But what Hidden Heretics argued was that the internet itself didn't create life-changing doubt. They were very quick to tell me that it was going to the library and reading old-fashioned books that was what actually changed their mind. But what social media did do for them was it saved them from thinking that they were all alone in the world or that they were insane, because that is part of what they had learned. Like, there was no reason that you would have these kinds of life-changing doubts. So it created what I decided to call was a heretical counterpublic. They were social relationships online where debates could happen in real time. There was a sharing of ideas. Even on blogs, you know, there are lists of other blogs that you can connect to. It really created a kind of community online of like-minded questioners, skeptics, co-frame heretics, where people could then begin to figure out what they were thinking, and they made suggestions to each other of things to read. In contrast to that, we have the ultra-Orthodox rabbinic leadership who over a decade went from blaming the internet. They had to be sort of told about blogs, but they went from blaming the internet for content and specifically for pornography to some saying that the medium itself was corrupting, especially smartphones, because of this kind of community building and mixing between men and women. And many began to call it the challenge of their generation, which every generation has its own challenge. And they compared it to other challenges in Jewish Orthodox existence, even the Holocaust or the Spanish Inquisition, for example. One of the posters that I saw that circulated on Facebook and then on WhatsApp was, it said in Yiddish, the Holocaust burned our bodies, but it was in English, sorry. The Holocaust burned our bodies, but the internet burns our souls. So there was a lot of kind of referring back to Jewish history also, but in very different ways. Like this was the challenge of the generation. What was very tricky for everybody was that religious leadership really couldn't censor the internet. They censored TV very successfully back in the 70s, but too many businesses relied on the internet. So the leadership began requiring filters, and they tied the acceptance of having their people's phones filtered to children's acceptance in their school, in the mostis. So Hasidic men actually over time really refused to give up their smartphones. They were required to, they had to sign a contract in order for their kids to attend these schools. So a lot of the Hasidic leadership in particular, it was mostly Hasidic men who refused, began to appeal to women. And there were kosher phone trade-ins where you could go and drop off your smartphone and get a flip phone that only texted. But they began to also hold these big rallies. And maybe some of you remember the 2012 anti-internet rally that took place at City Field. But that was for men, but they were huge rallies for women where rabbis begged them to, you know, protect their homes and the next generation. And all of this sort of playing out over the internet, basically.
So I definitely want to come back to that issue about the positionality of women relative to both doubt, the community of doubters, and the rabbinic authority. But before moving on to that, I want to ask you just to talk a bit about how you discuss the role of language and of language play and innovation in the Jewish blogosphere, because you make some interesting points about the way that language gets sort of manipulated and played around with as part of the counterpublic that you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, language, of course, is gendered too in these communities, with men speaking, at least for Hasidic men, speaking much more Yiddish than Hasidic women. The blogs, the earlier blogs, which were really from like the heyday of the blogs was like early 2000s, those were in English, and those were mostly yeshivish men. So it's ultra-Orthodox, but not Hasidic. And they speak a kind of yeshivish English, which is English mixed with Yiddish and Hebrew. And it was there that there was a lot of play with language, a lot of experimentation. There were a few Hasidic bloggers, and I profile actually 4 of them, who actually began to use Yiddish in different kinds of ways. Yiddish is both a vernacular, it's an everyday kind of language for Hasidic men in particular, but it's also used to study Torah. So you read a line in Hebrew and you study it and you discuss it in Yiddish. What some of the bloggers began to do was use Yiddish to experiment with secular literature and expressing themselves, their own changes that they were going through in Yiddish. And later, after blogs stopped being a thing and people moved over to social media, there's a really interesting forum, I think that's what it's called Kavashtibel, where men, and again, it's not required to be male to be in this group, but you have to have a certain proficiency in Yiddish. And a number of women told me that the writing on this forum is just too hard for them. But where men are not writing heresy necessarily, but are writing open-minded ideas. They had a poetry contest. They sometimes talked about Yiddish and critiqued Hasidic Yiddish in particular for not having a standardized set of rules, for not having standardized spelling, for trying to think through, are there regularized ways that we can have Hasidic English have a set grammar? The grammar is sometimes fluid. And so there was a real attention to kind of creating a new register for expressing these changes that they themselves were going through. And I decided to give it a name because I think it's a very different kind of Yiddish. And I've called it enlightened Hasidic Yiddish. And again, it's mainly for men, but it's Yiddish used to express the self and sort of interior changes that might not be able to be expressed if you weren't using a pseudonym, for example. I know one woman who logged on and somebody wrote to her and said, you know, you can stay on here, but you shouldn't write in English, you should write in Yiddish. So I know that there's a new magazine that circulates. I've ordered it a number of times. That's all in Yiddish. It's kind of a spin-off. Oh no, it's not a spin-off. It's just a separate magazine, but it doesn't actually have anything to do with moral didactism or religion necessarily. There's current events, there's little aspects of science and the weather in the issue that I just saw. It's for entertainment, really. It's leisure Hasidic Yiddish reading, which I hadn't seen before in my earlier research. So I think in some ways, digital media has actually been very helpful and created this flowering new sense of what Yiddish could be and who should be using it to express it and what it can do.
And yet, as you've been saying, those types of possibilities and innovations are gendered as well as the language itself. And one of the things that you talk about quite a bit in the book, and I'd like to hear you talk a bit more about now, is the fact that even within this continuum of doubt among people, among Jews, women do not have the same possibilities and the same options and are subject to more restrictions when it comes to doubt. So where do women fall on the continuum? Do they fall away from the continuum? And how is the experience and the efforts to mitigate the effects of doubt, how do those play out in women's lives as different from men's lives?
Yes, I will say that in my first project, I almost exclusively talked to mothers and daughters. I never talked to men. I didn't really have access to men. When I began this project, I had no access to women. I was exclusively talking to men, and it really puzzled me. And so I began to investigate that and ask why. And eventually I found a number of women to talk to. But in fact, men and women have very different reasons for life-changing doubt and opportunities for expressing it, just as they have different access to internet technology and smartphones. So I think there are structural factors. Part of that is when men and women get married at a pretty young age in ultra-Orthodoxy, like 17, 18, 19. For men, there's this incredible independence that they suddenly have. They're not necessarily, they might be just still studying Torah, but they're, in their own homes and they can do whatever they want. They have a lot of time to hang out. In fact, I used to meet a group of young men who hung out in Barnes and Noble and, just had coffee for long afternoons. But for a woman, she loses some of her independence. At young teenage Hasidic girls actually have a lot of independence. But once a girl gets married, she's in charge of the home. She's in charge of the children, which they hope they have. And her socializing really has to remain at home. She can't just take off in the middle of the night and go see her friends the way she might have used to and the way that her husband can. And if she does want to go off and take off in the middle of the night, her husband will want to know why. And she will have to find somebody to watch her children. So women at marriage are much more kind of surveilled in terms of not having as much independence. I do want to say also, I don't think I actually elaborated on this, but women, because they are in the home, don't have access to technology as much. Some women work in offices and they have access to desktops, but women had smartphones less. And when one woman in particular began to blog a lot, her rabbi told her husband to just take away her laptop. So men are really the husbands are much more able to control the kinds of access that women have. I was really struck by the kinds of different experiences that men and women had when they had life-changing doubt. A lot of men expressed sadness and devastation. The descriptions that men told me about their loss of faith were really profound. A sense of losing your way, of not knowing how to keep living. Your moral compass is gone. And that happened for some women too, of course, but a number of other women expressed anger to me. They expressed anger that when they had believed in the system, when they had believed in ultra-Orthodoxy, they were willing to give up certain of their own dreams, like either for learning certain religious text or for higher education or for becoming, having a career. But they were willing to do that because they believed in the system and they believed that what they were doing was right. And they believed that it would lead to happiness. And when it didn't, or when they were unable to control their doubting, they felt really angry that they had been, what one woman said, tricked by the system to just conform. So that really struck me, those different affective layers, affective responses. And then the rabbis and life coaches and therapists had different responses to men and women as well. Men often talked about intellectual reasons for their doubting. They always cited, I started to read biblical archaeology and I realized that the revelation at Mount Sinai certainly couldn't be true. But rabbis and therapists also explained their doubt as coming from intellectual sources. They were too curious, or something had happened that made them unable to just accept, but they were very intelligent. But for women, there were most often emotional explanations, like either she had postpartum depression or something had happened to her. Sometimes that was also for men, but there had been some kind of trauma that she couldn't recover from, or her school had been too strict. So again, the appeal to emotion and sometimes sexualization. I'll quote Naomi Seidman, who wrote a great piece about why she left her ultra-Orthodox home. And she said, "I hoped I was an intellectual, not a whore." I'm not totally quoting that, but you get the general idea that the implication was a girl was not going to be an intellectual. If she was having those kinds of life-changing doubt, it must have been some kind of internal inclination for evil or lust or uncontrolled yearning that would create that. And I'll say too that the consequences for men and women can be really different when life-changing doubt is discovered. Many women were reluctant to talk to me, especially in the beginning, but also keep their profiles very low because they're terrified that if their husbands discover them, they will request a divorce and they'll lose their children in a custody battle. So there's always that kind of fear. Men are afraid of that too, but women are more often, in my experience, told to just keep trying to keep the home going and your husband will gain his faith back. They're less often advised by rabbis to divorce. And when a woman does divorce, from what I've seen, it's also less rare to lose children. Although I think community members are really, they feel as if they're saving a child to not let that child go live with what they deem as a secular parent, And one thing that I hadn't realized that I grew increasingly interested in was what happened to the still religious spouses. Because in a marriage, right, one person might lose their faith, but another person the spouse might not at all. So there are consequences, as I sort of alluded to in that story of Ruchi, Yisrael's wife, where the wife had to become the spiritual authority in the family, which was not always a desirable thing because you were raised to think that your husband will be the spiritual authority and that's what a family should be. And suddenly you have to take on that authority. So despite perhaps less observant people thinking, well, that's great, she has more authority, the women that I talked to were devastated to have that authority. And the other thing is, of course, as Ruchi did, they had to keep their husband's secrets and lie for them often, either to the children or to the extended family. And these communities are really built on extended families who are very close. For men, I was fortunate to talk to one husband of a woman who was experiencing life-changing doubt. And he described to me feeling kind of publicly humiliated. You know, his brother said to him, or some relative said to him, like, what's happening with your wife? You know, his wife had started to change a little bit how she dressed. This is very common in people living double lives. She sort of pushed the envelope a little bit. She had taken off her hat. Her skirts had gotten a little bit shorter. And so one of his friends said to him, like, what's happening? And he said to me, I told her, like, she can't humiliate me like that on the street. You know, so there was a kind of public sense that the husband was in charge of the family. And when a wife started making those decisions on her own, which was certainly unacceptable, that there would be consequences.
Yeah, so obviously, you know, a lot of issues that we can go into there. And obviously, I'm sure that, you know, when we open it up for questions later on, you know, people will want to respond to some of that information, which is fascinating and troubling. But you did also refer to the religious therapists and the way in which people talk about doubt as in a kind of pathologizing way. And I wanted to talk about that chapter. So in chapter 5 of the book it's called Treatment of Doubt. It's where you talk about the different practitioners and professionals who are called upon to respond to doubt. That is to respond to the doubters and the double lifers in an attempt to cure them or to treat them. And so you talk about Jewish life coaches, you talk about rabbis, and you talk especially about religious therapists. And there's a wonderful anecdote right in the beginning of that chapter, which I absolutely love. You refer to an instance where someone sends in a letter to an advice column in an Orthodox newspaper to a Rabbi Tessler, who I guess is the advice columnist. And this person asks Rabbi Tessler about his doubt, that he's plagued with questions about his faith, about his belief, his emunah. And Tessler's response, I think, is very interesting, and it sets up that chapter really well. And I'll use it to set up a question. You know, Tessler's response, which I'm going to paraphrase, is he says, well, look, it could be one of two things. You could be under the influence of an evil inclination, what he calls the Yetzer Hara, which causes you to resist faith and to resist obedience in God, and that you should seek help from spiritual teachers who will strengthen your resolve. Or you might have OCD and you should probably get in touch with a psychiatrist, right? So, I mean, what is interesting to me about that story, which kind of makes you laugh and cry at the same time, but there are two kind of remarkable things about it. First of all, the rabbi presents these two things as different, right? I mean, there's the spiritual explanation and there's the psychiatric or psychotherapeutic explanation. But even though he's making a separation, there's an interesting element in that he is combining the two in the same response, right? He is presenting them as two viable options to solve the same problem. And in both cases, he's rendering doubt as a disorder, right? I mean, either it is a spiritual disorder or a mental disorder. It is an expression of evil or an expression of pathology. So there are a couple of questions that I want to ask about that. But the first one, and then I'll ask the other one later, is, you know, how would you characterize the way in which rabbinical authority and expertise and psychotherapeutic, psychiatric expertise are intersecting at this moment in time and in this community? Where are the boundaries being drawn? How are those boundaries being maintained? And who's getting the last word?
Yeah, that's a great question, Omri. So let me just begin by saying that therapy was taboo for a long time in the ultra-Orthodox communities. In the 1990s, though, Rabbi Twersky, who was a very well-known psychiatrist and rabbi, began to merge some of the ethical writings, which are called Musar, with more kind of self-help, like Alcoholics Anonymous, that kind of stuff. And this created, just like so much of technology is sort of made Jewish, this created a more kosher kind of therapy. Before that, therapy was really associated with Freud and sexuality, and Freud was a secular Jew, so it was quite taboo. But after the 90s, therapy, if not completely acceptable, at least it became less taboo. And what we see now are certain treatments that are very easily incorporated into a Jewish Orthodox framework and accepted by many ultra-Orthodox Jews, things like CBT. What does that stand for? Something behavioral therapy or medication. Thank you. You're right. I never can remember that. Cognitive behavioral therapy or medication. So these are short-term kinds of treatments. They, can be quite effective, and they don't, they medicalize in a way, right? They don't say that the person is a bad person, because one of the real I think important things that Rabbi Twersky managed to convey in a lot of his writings was a notion of the person that was less harsh. It wasn't just that you had good and evil in you, that there could sometimes be there could be sick illnesses, really, right? And so these illnesses could then be treated. So there were a lot of positive things that came out of some of his work, sort of like the acceptance of postpartum depression and its treatment. And then there were more questionable kinds of applications of some of that. And I don't want to sort of paint religious therapy with a very broad brush. There's a huge range of religious therapists, and there's a well-respected religious therapist organization that I write about, and many people there have professional training. But there are a number of life coaches and people who just call themselves from therapists who have less training, and who can sometimes do damage in their attempt to, what I call, it's a kind of triangulation. So speaking directly to your question now, what happened when certain kinds of therapies became acceptable in treating a kind of mental illness, when mental illness was sort of recognized as something that was biological and physical, there really grew to be a triangulated form of care where you have rabbis and therapists and the patient. So if a patient was experiencing either depression or sometimes life-changing doubt, then one of the first people who they would be referred to would be to a rabbi. A woman might be referred to a bride teacher, but whatever, or some kind of outreach rabbi. If that rabbi diagnosed or decided that that person was having mental issues or mental health issues, that rabbi would then refer the patient to a therapist. And sometimes it ended right there. The person would seek treatment, and that was fine. But there were some cases that I followed where the patient-client, where the client confidentiality was really violated, and where the therapist and the rabbi worked together and were both Orthodox. It was certainly not the rule, but there were times where they worked together and where they even exchanged information about the client or the patient with the spouse and the extended family of that patient, unbeknownst to the patient. So there could be really negative consequences for some hidden heretics. And I write about the story of one woman in particular who went to a number of different rabbis and what are called activists, askonim, who referred her to different therapists who all found different problems and prescribed different medications, none of the illnesses of which she actually had. And she eventually found a therapist, a Jewish therapist, who said, I don't know what they're telling you, but you do not have what they're telling you you have. You're depressed and you're anxious because you're in a really tight spot because you no longer believe. We can work on that, but you are not mentally ill. So, for people living double lives, there was both the danger of therapists being too complicit with rabbis, but at the same time, therapy could be a place where they were really validated. So if the therapist was professional enough, and I met a lot of super professional therapists, they could actually find validation. And part of that chapter is a person living a double life who wrote to Rabbi Tesler and complained, like, how dare you say, it's either OCD or you need to consult a rabbi. Like, I relied on you. I trusted you. I thought, here's somebody who understands two things. And they had a long back and forth through letters, which he shared with me. And there really was no conclusion. The Rabbi Tesler at the end just said, your intelligence is not a help to you. I'm sorry, I can't help you.
So I'm actually going to skip the second question that I was going to ask about that in the interest of time, and you pretty much covered it anyway. But I wanted to ask about how this project has shaped or changed your sense or your understanding of the ultra-Orthodox family. Because when you wrote Mitzvah Girls, you did a lot of research, which is a book about child socialization, child enculturation. And so you spent time with families and you were talking about family life, and you got a sense of the importance, which is certainly reinforced in this project as well, the importance of the family unit as a pillar in ultra-Orthodox life and its link to community. And here in this research, you're getting a whole different side of the family, right? I mean, the family is a place of secrets. The family is a place of concern and fear and doubt. So I wonder if you might reflect just in general on how this project, especially for you spending so many years in contact with these communities and now coming at it from a very different angle, how has it changed, or has it changed your perception of ultra-Orthodox family life in general?
Yeah, it really did change it a lot. My first project was really with how girls learn to fit in to their families and learn to, eventually grow up and get married. I looked at a few girls who couldn't fit in or wouldn't fit in, but I had much less access to teens then, and it was a very different time. While I began this project working with individuals, and I spent a lot of time, with adults doing things they shouldn't be doing and hanging out, whatever, it occurred to me that I grew increasingly curious about how they dealt with their families, given that they had this whole other life. In some cases, other partners and really very different lives than most of their families knew. But I couldn't really spend time in families. I'll tell you in a minute that I was fortunate to speak to one teenager, but nobody would invite me to their home. I mean, I invited myself constantly, but nobody would have me for a Shabbos because, it was too dangerous. Like, why risk it? And I didn't blame them at all. But I knew that families were really important sites because that's where really the ethics of living a double life was being played out as it was transmitted and changed to the next generation. I began to ask people about their family. So a lot of this is reporting about parents and their children. So one of the things that happens when you begin to live a double life is you begin to embrace a kind of alternative set of ethics or moral values, one that are really in conflict with what they used to believe. And these are usually secular liberal values of pluralism, tolerance, individual autonomy, things like choice. So double life parents wanted to bring this new system of ethics into their homes, but it had to be expressed really subtly because they didn't want to confuse their kids. There was a lot of discussion about confusing children or get them in trouble with their schools or with a still religious parent. I was actually initially surprised. I had assumed that they would want their children to grow up and be secular, something that they weren't probably going to do. And like many of my assumptions, it really turned out not to be true. What they wanted their children to have, and in some ways, having their kids grow up to be secular would have distanced them to a large degree. It would have made them seem like, one guy said to me, would I want my kid to be a lawyer? Well, I guess, but then we'd have nothing to talk about. So what they all wanted, they told me, was for their children to have a choice, something that they didn't feel that they had. So they began to make small changes in their parenting and in family holidays and stuff to try to sort of expose them to what they called critical thinking, to being a little more tolerant. They allowed them to use things like Google. If they were sort of grown up enough, as they said, to not share that happened at school. They tried to teach them to value diversity. One mom refused to let her kids call the cleaning lady the goita. That's the female for goy. She said, you know, you got to call her by her name. Everybody's a person. So very subtle ways. There was one man who didn't want to bring his son to the mikvah. He didn't believe in that anymore. So the son just went by himself. So there were very subtle kinds of introductions of other ideas. This could be really hard on teens, and it could be really hard on a still religious spouse. For teens, it was quite confusing because, as anyone who has a teenager at home knows, they figure out things, any secrets that you have, very quickly. Some became more religious and others less. There were a few kids I met who I heard about who, as their father actually became less and less observant and moved away from the community, they followed him. Some felt that they had to protect themselves from the influence of their own parents. One young woman I heard said to her mother, you know, I'm going to come and stay with you, but don't tell me anything I shouldn't hear. Don't show me anything. And others simply decided, and I think this was probably easier for sons in some ways, that their parents' control over their baser instincts, what are called your taivas, your lusts, just wasn't good enough. And that was their kind of religious challenge. And so they were able to separate themselves in that way. I met one young teenager. Her mother introduced me to her. I couldn't figure out why she was willing to talk to me until she came to my office and she said, I know what my mother is, and I'm really angry, and I know you're writing a book, and I want to tell everybody out there, you know, what they're doing is really wrong. It's confusing children, and it's against everything that we stand for, and I know that I'm going to stay religious, and I'm really grateful that I made my own choice to stay religious. And to me, that was very ironic because that was really what her mother had hoped for, that she would make her own choice, no matter where it fell, you know. But I was grateful to meet her a couple of times and hear her perspective. And, you know, she started crying in the middle of one of our interviews. It was difficult. And that kind of raises the issue of where your own ethics as an anthropologist lie. You know, I didn't want to upset her. I backed off, and I was surprised when she called me again, actually. But yeah, families were really interesting sites. And I'm also very curious about what happens, and I'm thinking about looking at this a little bit. I'm not sure if I'll have even access, but what happens in those kinds of cases of custody. Because again, those are very tricky situations where ideas about religiosity and secularism are getting articulated by very different people for different reasons.
Well, you mentioned the idea of choice and the centrality of that concern and that sort of imperative in these lives. And it's a good point to remind ourselves that the word heretic is derived from a Greek word meaning choice, or the ability to choose. So it's an interesting, you know, and non-accidental connection, obviously. And so it also links to the last question that I want to ask. And I also want to remind everybody to, if you have questions, to put them in the chat, and we're going to open it up to questions in just a few minutes. But this question takes us a little bit outside of the book, but I want to ask your expertise about this because there have been a lot of movies and a lot of cultural production in the last few years about ultra-Orthodox lives. And very recently there was Unorthodox on Netflix, which, you know, got a lot of media attention, and the Israeli series Shtisel, and there have been documentaries like the film One of Us. And there's the common thread in a lot of these popular media forms around Hasidic life and ultra-Orthodox life is at the center, there's always an individual who's trying to find their authentic self, right? Or who's sort of embracing tradition, but also kind of pushing against tradition in some way. And there's something about, you know, the modern liberal religious mind that loves that narrative, right, of the authentic self that escapes from stringent religion. So apart from the question of why this is such a popular issue in general in the culture, how, or do you have a sense of how people in the community that you're studying react to these types of films and books and memoirs and so forth?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Definitely this cultural production is often, I think, aimed at a secular Jewish reading public. You know, those stories, I mean, I really enjoyed watching Unorthodox, but those stories of a young woman especially who kind of frees herself from the shackles of a misogynist religious culture or framed as a cult, is very satisfying, I think, to less observant or non-observant viewers. And you're right, it totally hits all the notes for like what freedom is, the role of choice, finding your true self, all of those things. I've been interested in the kind of response. I've heard a lot of different response, like some people who have left their communities. Some were very critical, interestingly enough, of unorthodox. A few were critical, saying that the ultra-Orthodox communities that were depicted in that miniseries seem so sour and depressing. And in fact, they're very lively and, for some people, a wonderful place to be. So I think that's probably accurate. One of us I know was an important documentary for a lot of people also who've left. It validated a lot of their stories and a lot of the kinds of dangers that they faced. I noticed that one of the interesting responses among the hidden heretics that I've been spending time with is that they're very concerned with accuracy and whether stories are accurate, whether there's truth to how they're being represented. And in some ways, maybe that's part of their training in studying religious texts and finding truth in it, and debating and seeing what's true and what's not true. I know with my own book, when I began to meet people for interviews for this project, one of the people who would later become a really key person that I spoke to and a friend, brought my book with him to our drink and, showed me all the places where I had made mistakes or where I got it right. So there's a lot of, I think, respect, especially for books and also for texts and for seeing their stories represented. They all, from what I hear, everybody has watched all of those, like Shtisel, Unorthodox, One of Us, on smartphones, away from family, with family. So despite not having televisions, there was a very wide watch. And I know that a lot of people were in the ultra-Orthodox communities were kind of upset at, especially One of Us, and feeling like it didn't represent them fairly. I think Shtisel is one of the more interesting ones because I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but he actually struggles with issues of creativity and not fitting in, and yet he doesn't really lose his desire to be in his community, and he has opportunities to leave or to have a different life or even to experiment to some extent, and he doesn't. And I think that's really challenging for more secular viewership in a good way. I think it complicates those kind of polar opposites that we're too often presented with.
I think this is a really good point to perhaps open the floor to questions. And I just want to invite you again to please type your question in the chat box. Actually, there was a question that was asked early on by Mark Kaplan, who I think had to leave already. And I think he was referring to, I'm not sure if to a garment or, so he's asking, is that mileless? And I'm not sure exactly when the question was asked in reference to perhaps an Yiddish term that you were using.
What term? I don't know.
M-A-Y-L-E-S, mileless.
Oh, maybe that's a person, I think.
Oh, okay.
I'm really not sure. I'm gonna have to ask.
Yeah, so that was a specific moment in the conversation. Yeah, we're still waiting for questions.
Oh, I see where he wrote that. Oh, yeah, okay.
So there's a question that's just come up. To what extent was LGBT identity a common drive for your subjects?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. It was not from anyone I worked with practically. I was puzzled by that because I thought, that would actually be something that would be a driver. But it's from people that I asked, it seemed like if you discovered that you were, if you discovered that you were gay or you decided that you were gay, most often that happened before marriage, and often people left. They wouldn't stay and live a double life. One woman said to me, it would just be too lonely and too terrible and too sad to be in a marriage that you couldn't experience any love in, and and you would be so lonely, because really life in those communities are really organized around family, nuclear family, and then extended family. So I know there are a few people, and I talked to one interesting couple in particular who she was gay and he was gay, and the matchmaker decided it was a perfect match. And so they actually each had a separate partner and had a child, but eventually one of those people left. You know, her daughter grew a little bit older and said, "Why are we always lying?" And so they decided to go and leave the community. But I think people leave when they discover that they're gay more.
There's another question that just came in from James Below. As a linguistic anthropology, is asking, were there any emergent genres created by the heretics or notable forms of play with existing genres? Thank you very much.
That's a great question. There was a lot of poetry writing, both in English and in Yiddish and in Hebrew. What I was always interested in was a number of different people on social media took up the Robert Frost, I took, The Road Diverged, and took that up and sort of gave their own spin. One person translated it into Yiddish, and another person just changed the words, but kept sort of the form. So there was a lot of play with poetry, I would say. Again, the non-religious literature, I would say, is a genre that is emerging. So reading for entertainment in Yiddish in particular is, that's a new genre. I think that, and there are some that are just religious, that are still, totally, I don't mean religious, that are not morally didactic, but don't contain any heresy. So a kid could read it on a Shabbos. But the idea that you would use Yiddish to actually express either personal feelings or just to share knowledge, like knowledge about the wider world or current events, for example. I mean, you have, the Yiddish newspapers that do that, but to have this kind of leisure reading for men when they could be studying the Torah, right? And instead they're reading a magazine, that's kind of interesting and challenging, I think. I don't think there's that much, or I at least haven't seen that much new music. Music itself is a very interesting genre where there's all kinds of changes. I know now that a lot of people have access to the internet, some of the appropriation of Yiddish tunes, of non-Jewish tunes that then get infused with Jewish meaning are easily traced to their original sources in ways that they weren't before. So that is interesting in terms of who gets to say what is authentic and what isn't. Those are the main ones, I would say, though, James. That's a great question. Thank you.
I'll ask a question as well. I actually wonder, I know that you keep in touch with your subjects, and I wonder if you've been in touch with them recently and how COVID has impacted their life and attempts at, spending time outside of the community.
Yeah, my WhatsApp has just exploded. I thought once my book was finished, I wouldn't be on WhatsApp anymore, but I actually, especially since the pandemic, I have been. They've been really critical, at least my main group, and we didn't talk about this so much, but the group that I have, I asked to be admitted to someone's WhatsApp group because I saw that it was a circle of friends and I really wanted to be able to get in there. It seemed really important. And then one of the administrators there said, you can't join our group, but I'll make a mirror group for you. And I'll tell everybody that, you are doing this. So they've been very critical of the ultra-Orthodox response in Brooklyn and upstate to COVID. They were critical in the spring, and they've become even more critical now with the recent spike in New York City. And we've talked about it a lot because I've gotten really curious in what exactly is going on. Like, it's very easy to understand the kind of theological or religious sort of barriers, like, you have to meet with other people to pray, or you have to celebrate someone's wedding, it's a mitzvah. And it's easy to understand the practical dimension too, like 10 kids in a house, no internet, what are you going to do? Like, how can you live in a tiny New York apartment? So that's all, I think, really understandable. But what I started to see, which I was surprised, was a kind of suspicion or a rejection of scientific authority, especially around infectious disease. As I said, like ultra-Orthodox Jews really embrace medical science, genetic testing, reproductive technologies. They've found ways to make it work for their communities. But with infectious disease, there are new kind of alliances that I've seen that I've been really curious to follow. It began with the measles outbreak and the kind of alliance between anti-vaxxers, especially women, and who were not Jewish or religious necessarily, who were sort of disseminating, and I'm not sure, no one has been able to tell me where that literature came from, but disseminating literature on the danger of vaccines. And so, you know, we had that big spike in the measles, and I see a very similar pattern actually in what's going on with COVID, a kind of suspicion of scientific authority, a rejection of that. And I am wondering if that is related to the kind of overwhelming support for Donald Trump that so many of the ultra-Orthodox have articulated. You know, there's been overwhelming numbers of votes for him in New York City. And I see that alliance as really part of either Christian nationalism or a certain kind of right and white kind of movement that is socially conservative. And we can see this in the way, I think, that ultra-Orthodox Jews and some of their political elected officials have talked about how they interface with the wider community. When I was doing my first fieldwork for Mitzvah Girls, you know, there was a lot of talk about, well, Hasidic Jews are just like any other minority, and they need to have the rights that any minority has. What I hear these days, both on digital media and in person, is much more about religious freedom. Like, this is a religious freedom issue. And I see that as a kind of alliance with Trump politics in some ways.
That's interesting. There's another question. I've read that there have been a few cases of suicide among those who have left the fold and have had to leave their children behind because their spouse and the community have cut them off completely. How common is that today?
Yeah, those are horrible stories. I haven't heard any of those lately. Of course, there might be, but usually from what I've seen, they're very public, you know, because it's really an indictment of the community that has driven somebody to commit suicide because they have what's called parental alienation, which means their kids have sort of been separated from them because they are no longer observant, the parent. And I know there were several really, really public cases of women committing suicide because their children refused to visit with them. Really tragic cases. And Shulam Dean writes a little bit about that too in his memoir, All Who Go Do Not Return, where his children wouldn't see him. He went to his daughter's wedding and she saw him for a second, but you know, they didn't even invite him. So I think there are many more supports for people who leave nowadays. Footsteps, even though hidden heretics would never be caught near footsteps because it's such a sign that you are doubting or fraternizing with people who have left the community. Footsteps is an important organization that supports people, as they say, who are questioning or you know, wondering about where they should live their lives. So I think and they offer financial and emotional and therapeutic support. And there are also more models, I think, for how to successfully leave your community and maintain ties with your family, as it has become more common. I think just from the numbers, I don't think there's this flood of people leaving as so many worry about. But if you have 10 kids, the chances are they're not all going to fall right in line. So I've heard people say almost every family now has somebody who has left the community or even has become modern Orthodox, which is sort of considered leaving, ironically. So it's become less of a kind of black mark against a lot of the families, especially in matchmaking. It doesn't say anything necessarily about you know, the genetic makeup of the family, like somehow they couldn't control their evil inclination. And there's a small group of therapists who have gotten the approval of a number of rabbis. It's called tangled parenting. And they advocate that instead of cutting off your child who is leaving or has doubts, that you need to prioritize your child and your relationship with your child over your religion. So if you know your child is breaking all of these commandments, it's more important to show your child that you love them than to say, I'm going to sit Shiva for you, which was the sort of stereotypical response, or at least cut ties. And I think there's that movement, it's smaller, but I think there are a number of cases now where people have maintained ties with their family. Again, maybe that's easier for men. I tried to find that out and I wasn't 100% sure. I think because men have financial independence much more than women, that's probably true. And they can afford a lawyer more and all of that. But I feel like there are some changes, and people who have left, who are either part of Footsteps or part of other organizations who support people who are leaving, have been very vocal. I think one of us was an important kind of piece that they could point to, like, these are the kinds of violences that have been done to us. So I think it's a very different kind of face of people who have left than it used to be, which just was, oh, they're all drug addicts and they're prostitutes and they're falling apart. So I do think that's changing, and I hope that will lead to fewer suicides. But parental alienation is a real, it's a real issue, and it makes sense because if children, I mean, it doesn't make sense, but if children are learning that Jews who aren't observant are somehow bad, when their own parent becomes that person, it's very traumatizing for the kid and the spouse, of course, but also for the kid. And they're hearing in school, like, you know, your parent's not a Jew, your parent's a goy. It's very complicated for children. And so they are the ones who are the real losers in these cases, I think.
Okay, so a question that just came in. Have the secret lives of hidden heretics been limited by the coronavirus and quarantine? Is their online world without much in-person contact sufficient connection?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know 100% the answer to that. I know that the online component has been very active. I know that hidden heretics tend to wear masks, which is interesting. I talked with one of them about whether wearing a mask became a sign that you were doubting, which is bizarre. But I think I'm sure that they have found ways to meet up. I've heard that some are going out to dinner still, outside with masks. But they, in general, what I've heard is less about the socializing and more about their willingness to shelter in place and to, follow social distancing and wearing masks, and how that kind of puts them at odds with their communities. And they're also, of course, the people who tended to not vote for Trump and not be Trump supporters. So it kind of fits the whole broader picture. I've mainly seen a lot of criticism. I mean, I'm not actively doing fieldwork, although I sometimes can't help it. But I haven't actually gone to Brooklyn for events myself lately. But I know that the online life is alive and well, and it's very critical of what's going on now. Thank you. Now I'm going to have to ask more questions. I better ask that right away.
Are there any final questions? We just have a few minutes left. And if not, let me just remind you that Princeton is running currently a 30% discount on the book with free shipping, and you can find the code in the chat box.
And I'll just say thank you again. Omri, thank you so much. That was very generous, and it's always fun to be in conversation with you. And thank you, Francesca, for having me, and to all of you too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ayla. Thank you so much, Omri, for such a productive conversation. I think it looks like there are no more questions, so we're gonna end here our evening. I just want to remind you that we have another program coming up on November 19th at 5 p.m. and it's going to be a conversation between Marina Rastow and Arnold Franklin on Marina Rastow's recent book, The Lost Archive, which deals with the Cairo Geniza. So thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's event. It's been a pleasure. Thank you again, Ayla and Omri, for such a lively and fruitful conversation.
Great. Thank you.